Thank you for joining us today. We have a couple more folks filing in, so grab your favorite beverage or a snack and find your virtual seat, and we'll be starting in just a minute. And we still have some folks that are still trying to find their seats. We'll be starting again in just a minute. All right, looks like everyone has found their seats. Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, Accelerating Free Energy Binding SIMs, brought to you by QuantumBio and GridMarkets. Over the next hour, we will explore how QuantumBio's MovableType, running on GridMarkets, will accelerate your drug discovery ligand simulations from days to minutes, accurately, securely, and cost-effectively. My name is Wendy Neiman, and I'll be your moderator for our time together today. A few housekeeping items before we get started with today's presentation. Your mics have been muted during the presentation, but if you do have a question, please drop it in the Zoom Q&A tab located at the bottom right of your screen. We're going to wrap up today's presentation with a Q&A session at the end. And now, without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Lance Westerhoff, President and General Manager with QuantumBio. Dr. Westerhoff is an entrepreneur and computational chemist. He helped start QuantumBio when he was a grad student at Penn State University. Lance is a published scientist with projects involving the development of methods for the application of quantum mechanics, molecular mechanics, and free energy simulation in the life sciences, X-ray crystallography, and computer-aided drug discovery. He has successfully overseen the research, development, and deployment of advanced technology within QuantumBio and implementation of these tools in the pharmaceutical industry. Lance is participating in the ACS Fall Conference in Chicago, and if you would like to meet him while you're on the ground in Chicago as well, please contact him at the email address on your screen. And now, without further delay, welcome, Lance.
Thank you, Wendy. I really appreciate the introduction, and I'm happy to be here. Today, we're going to go through the MovableType method, go over some theoretical underpinnings of the approach, so some of our applications of it in end state scoring, ligand sampling, some active site sampling, and then finally we'll discuss the ensemble binding affinity prediction, which is a key differentiator of the method. We'll also go through some of the impacts of increased target sampling and then some case studies, and then we'll also talk about some usage. Most of the discussion here has been recently published in a paper at JCIM. I certainly introduce or encourage people to take a look at it. It is available online under active open access. And it should give you a good understanding of how the method was developed, the different deployments, and certainly the validation of the method itself. So just some broad strokes about the method. It is a patented method that was recently licensed from Michigan State University. And a key differentiator is that it uses both a localized sampling and a global sampling approach. And we'll go through each one of those, but in general, you can think of the global sampling as poses that were generated maybe from docking, maybe from molecular dynamics, potentially even from some cross-docking or some different ways of exploring the protein and the protein ligand structure. And then localized sampling is really the key benefit or the key technology that is allowing some local sampling of each one of those globally sampled pieces. We'll talk a little bit about how this is used for calculating binding modes, conformations, and then finally, of course, affinity on the free energy surface. It is a really high throughput method, which can be a good beneficiary if you are going through and doing drug discovery, drug development, either in the end state mode, which it takes about 5 seconds or so, maybe 10 seconds to run, or the multi-compound mode or ensemble mode, which is takes something along the lines of can be as short as 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so to run. We are using all these or treating all these in the landscape minima. So if you think about whether it's docking or again molecular dynamics or any of the structures that you're providing, these are considered landscape minima. You can use a docker such as Mo, which is accessible through GridMarkets, or you can use, of course, your own docker, maybe Glide or any other technology you prefer. It's compatible with a number of different interfaces, whether in this case, of course, we'll be talking about GridMarkets. It's also available for clusters, workstations, laptops. And then finally, the ways that you can integrate with it could be anything from the command line to the graphical user interface using Mo, or even a web service or JSON. And then finally, it is something that we consider user-friendly in the sense that unless you need to use molecular dynamics for a particular structure, oftentimes docking alone is good enough. And that's something that, that allows you to use something that you're usually used to doing on a day-to-day basis today. If you think about the method and how it fits within the whole field, MovableType is an orthogonal approach for free energy characterization. And when I say orthogonal, it would be orthogonal to a general molecular dynamics approach. They're both key or very similar in the sense that they are both using statistical mechanics. They're both considered quote unquote theoretically complete. They also can both use very similar pair potentials in the sense that both have access to amber or amber-like force fields. And MovableType, of course, also has its own statistical potential available as well. And then finally, they both rely on an ensembles of structures. So it's not just a single protein ligand complex or a single X-ray structure, for example, that we're using. We're actually using all of them or a whole slew of structures. Where things are where the methods differs is where molecular dynamics requires very long run times. MovableType can use very local structures that have been generated from docking. And so therefore we're using blurring instead of a whole lot of dynamics to sample the space. And then therefore that gives a MovableType a higher throughput where docking is the landscape minima. The speed is very near real time. And then of course we have good convergence and ease of use. So if you think about the problem that we're trying to solve, and this would be similar to any other approach that's available out there, is that in the ideal world, we would sample the entire space or the entire surface. Of course, because we want to get our jobs done in a reasonable amount of time, this is impossible. So instead, what we do is we sample along the surface, usually using dynamics or some tool of that nature, where we're usually sampling in these lower energy points. We tend to not sample a whole lot of high energy points, but a lot of these low points. That, of course, takes a lot of time, or can take a lot of time to sample a significant amount of the space. And so what we do instead with MovableType is we can still do that sample if we like, especially if we have a structure that might move around a lot or in some way is something that we want to explore that. But what we do in MovableType is we'll take maybe a single set of coordinates, and then we blur those coordinates. And so instead of using a single out to 3 decimal places that might be in a PDB structure, we're going to use a smearing method that smears between every single structure or every single atom within the structure. So we can think of that as atom type A to atom type A in the ligand in the protein, atom type A in the ligand, atom type B in the protein, atom type A in the ligand, and atom type C in the protein, and so on and so forth. Each one of those, if you think about it, has a distance to it, maybe 3.6 angstroms, 2.9 angstroms, so on and so forth. Instead of just taking that single distance and providing that in a Leder-Jones potential or some potential, we take a whole slew of distances. And so we'll actually do plus or minus about 0.5 angstroms on either side of the distance. And so that gives us now a vector of potential energies. We put that into a partition function, and then finally from there we can calculate the binding affinity. This then allows us, when we're putting this together with multiple structures or multiple poses, again from docking or molecular dynamics or whatnot, and we can now sample a bunch of different positions. And so you can imagine if you have a structure that might be significantly different upon binding, whether that's in 1 or 2 different binding modes, each one of those now can be treated within the structure, or excuse me, within the model. And so then when we go back to our example here, if we're looking at this nice surface, we have that smearing process that's going on. And if we are now presenting 25, in this example, 25 different poses, again, maybe from docking or dynamics, and that smearing now, it becomes the red dots around each one of those 25 black dots. And so now you can see we're exploring, of course, a lot of low energy points, and then also now a bunch of high energy points as well. And so that gives us a much better representation now of the overall surface that would be a little bit more difficult to do if you were just doing in dynamics specifically. And if docking is predictive enough, and you're given a good enough set of structures, then at that point, then you've been able to solve this model very, very quickly. So when we think about the overall workflow, and some of the examples here I'm going to review, if you have we treat everything as a set of nexus points, and those could be protein structures, those could be docked structures, so on and so forth. All of the examples we'll talk about today are rigid receptor docking with one target and one conformer, and induced fit docking with N target or N bound conformers. And then more recently now we've added support for dynamic snapshots and of course APO and holo structures as well. So this overall workflow takes a PDB structure or a set of PDB structures for the protein and the ligand. It goes through Mo or Glide or Gold or any other docker to generate a set of poses, and then feeds all of those poses into the ensemble score. Similarly for MTCS, we may go through and treat an entire set of conformers for the ligand. So again, that becomes our unbound ligand conformer set. All of that is provided to the end state score, or excuse me, the ensemble score, and then we get that overall binding affinity. So if you think about then that, or we've then applied that to a more recent structure set, which was this PDBBind benchmark, where you had 51 sets with 5 X-ray models. Now this of course would be what we consider a wide breadth set, where you have many, many structures or many, many different targets, and you only have a few molecules per target. In a few minutes, I'll go the other way around, where I will have a very few, a smaller set of protein targets and a much larger set of ligands. The nice thing about this is it gives us a good understanding of where its strengths and weaknesses are. So if we treat this, when we treat this whole set of, again, 51 sets with 5 X-ray models each, along the y-axis here, you can see a Mo rigidly docked poses. So therefore, we have approximately 25 poses or so per protein structure. And in the case of the X-ray structures, we have, again, a single X-ray structure for each one of those 5 models, again, in 51 sets. And in the 45-degree angle, that would be if they were equivalent. So these would be equivalently predictive, whether you're talking about docked poses or X-ray poses. And this is critical because obviously, if we already have the X-ray pose, we've generally already figured out the binding affinity. So the rest wouldn't necessarily be necessary. But if you're using just docking, maybe a novel compound, that's all you end up with. So this is what we really wanted to see, a good, consistent results or good, consistent comparison between an X-ray model and a set of docked models. And we felt that was very encouraging. In this case, then, interestingly enough, you see there's a set here, though, where these were actually better or improved upon. So these were better with a number of docked poses than what was available in the X-ray or the PDB. Now, that could be caused, if you think about it, 2 or 3 different ways. One way is, of course, the X-ray model could just simply be wrong. Maybe in the case of factor 10A, for example, we know that there are sometimes some problems with some of the X-ray structures. So that could have been what's caused that problem. But in some of the other models here, there actually could be that we needed more binding modes, additional binding modes beyond what was available in the X-ray structure. When we think about this was the Pearson R, so that's the correlation between the binding affinity of prediction versus the experiment. In this case, we have the mean unsigned error, or the error associated with that. And again, we try to keep within about a kcal or so. So here we have a 1 kcal that came out of the docked poses through MovableType, and the 1 kcal within X-ray poses. So everything within this quadrant was approximately equivalently predictive, whether you're talking about, again, a set of X-ray structures or the bound structures from the docker. Then, of course, then you had a few that were outside. But again, we had some that were in here that were actually better, were improved upon when you had a number of different poses. Again, we see that in the factor 10A case. So now once we've taken it from our wide breadth set, now we'll go ahead and look at our specific set, or the one that we have as X number of targets. In this case, we have approximately 12 targets with anywhere from 12 ligands on up to 47 ligands in each one of these sets. And again, here's the end state score just on the X-ray pose. And so therefore you could think of that as kind of the high expense pose. That one took a lot of experiment to get that pose versus the 25 dock poses. Now, in all these cases, we didn't put the X-ray pose into the dock poses. Now, of course, the docker could have found that X-ray pose, but we didn't actually pepper them in or provide it. And you can see, again, consistently, these were very similarly predictive, where you have, in this case, is the R between the predicted versus the experiment. Again, the mean R versus the mean R, mean unsigned error versus the mean unsigned error. And you can see a lot of very good, consistent results, regardless of how the structures, the global structures were generated. So it's great when docking works, and certainly that's something that we try first. And why do we do that? Of course, is that docking tends to be very fast. Even though in this case we certainly allowed the docker to do as much optimization of the structures as it could. We know that if a structure might be doing a lot of movement, or maybe if the docker isn't fully exploring the space within the active site, then maybe the docking alone wouldn't be as good for certain cases. So can we do more sampling to lead to better predictions? And so we could think of this maybe using MMPBSA trajectories, maybe using docking and cross-docking, maybe active site rotamer sampling, certainly approximate MD, those sorts of methods could all be brought to bear to solve this problem. And so in this particular case, we're going to explore a situation where we just use conventional molecular dynamics and provided these molecular dynamics results to the MovableType method. And I should definitely footnote that John Zhang at Wuhan University was the person that actually had run through most of this these molecular dynamics calculations, and he's been a really nice critical partner of ours during this process. So for this, if you recall from earlier in the talk, we discussed what the overall workflow was, where we had a set of PDBs, provide that to the docker, and then generate the poses. In this case, we weren't using the docker. Instead, we were using Amber. And so John had run through, he generated, I believe he's about 250 nanoseconds of conventional molecular dynamics per structure, per ligand, and then just simply took a set of snapshots. Approximately 25 snapshots were taken in each case. And then all of that was provided to the MT score E or ensemble score. Instead of, again, just taking one winning pose, all of them were provided to the overall scoring function. So when we treat it in this case, we can see right away that there are situations where we get better performance or better predictability with the dynamics poses than without. So in this case, in CMET, EG5 with this alternate loop, so on and so forth, they were actually very similar whether you're talking about docking or without docking. But in these two circled cases, they were significantly different. They were significantly better with a little bit of dynamics than with just docking alone. And again, that's really encouraging, where if you had a situation where, again, docking was good enough and was predictive enough, then you're done, and you can treat it as a completed simulation. But if the docking wasn't good enough or wasn't providing enough really good binding modes, there are situations where it would be better, and we could certainly do that additional sampling. It does give you additional information. If you prefer, there's the Kendall-Tau results, again, very similar, where you had non-significant interactions here or non-significant predictions here, and then finally much better predictions with a little bit of dynamics. So again, it was nice. It was good, consistent results to see that in many cases, whether you did docking or dynamics, it was good enough. In cases where it was not, we were able to get some additional information. Now, of course, the question that comes up is why. Of course, it's great to see that we have better predictions, but why is that? And what are we able to tease out with MovableType, and of course with some additional sampling? And if you look at the top end here, this is the molecular dynamics results versus the induced fit docking results. Well, we can see it right off where there was better interactions between the ligand and certain residues, in this case the valine 213. And very weak interactions with these other residues, where interestingly enough, the induced fit just happened to choose the other way around. there were no interactions with that valine and really good interactions with these other three residues. And so that tends to be a problem that we oftentimes see in docking, where docking is extremely useful if it's a well understood active site, or if the active site isn't doing a lot of movement upon binding. But in a case where there might be a little bit more movement, or maybe a little bit more sampling is required, dynamics is really where things become beneficiary and certainly more predictive. We can see another case, again, this situation where on the left-hand side here is the molecular dynamics poses, and on the right-hand side of the induced fit poses. And you can see where the MD poses are actually tucking into the active site a little bit differently. And you can see, again, a different set of interactions. I should note that this paper will actually be out, should be out later on this year. It's just under review now. So just a quick rundown of some conclusions. It is a high throughput method, but it still does require a little bit of it's a very high predictive method, but it is something that does require a certain amount of landscape minima generation, whether that is docking, whether that's molecular dynamics, some optimization that tends to happen. So really the goal here isn't to run as fast a docking as possible, is to provide good global minima that'll work in many different binding modes. It yields both an end state. If you have a good structure, a single good structure, or maybe an X-ray structure, certainly an end state is oftentimes good enough, or ensemble scores on a set of poses. And that, again, is a key differentiator, where all of the scores that we talked about are not just a single pose. It's using an ensemble of poses. We use this protocol, again, we couple it with docking, we couple it with induced fit docking, or even more recently with dynamics. And then finally, as we move forward, we're able to treat both the holo structure, which of course is the docked or fully put together structure, and also the apo structure. And these I didn't really go through many results there, but more recently we've added the capability of using multiple snapshots of the unbound protein to do the ZP partition function as well. Now we'll go ahead and run a demonstration. I can start Mo, and I open up my PDB file. And once that's open, we'll go ahead and open our mol2 file with the ligand. Now, these could be in the same file, separate file. At this point, it's really all that Mo is or you're accustomed to using when you use Mo. So at this stage, we're completely within Mo and Mo's ability to process files. So these could be mol2 files, SDF files, mol2 files. It really doesn't matter at this stage. It's completely separate from anything that's having to do with GridMarkets or MovableType or anything else. But when you do want to start a MovableType, the interface, we go up to this now. This extra menu has appeared because of what we did a few minutes ago within the Mo files directory. So there's an extra QuantumBio, and then there's your MT score ES sidecar, which will start right along the side here. Now at this stage, everything that's over here on the left is still Mo proper, and that's exactly what you would be experiencing if you used Mo. All of your same menu items are there, all of your same functionality is there. Everything then over in the sidecar, that's what's been developed specifically to communicate with and run MovableType on GridMarkets within our package. So to begin, we look at what server has been installed, and we can do that by clicking this little gearbox here. Once you bring up the gearbox, you have some options. You can either run the software going forward on a local executable, on your laptop or workstation, on your own cluster, on a web service, again, installed locally, or in this case, well, of course, we're going to go ahead and run it on the cloud within GridMarkets. And each one of these has its own set of features and its own set of settings based upon what environment you're required. This is, of course, plugin 2, which you may have noticed is the one that we just installed a minute ago. And then, of course, it'll give you your username information and so on and so forth. And it also talks to your local computer where the Envoy package has been installed. And in this case, it's version 4.04. Once we hit that, then it actually jumps to Envoy And now you can see all the jobs that you've run recently, any sort of submissions. You can obtain support and review logs and so on and so forth. And of course, if you need to purchase any new credits, you could do that here as well. Let's go ahead and go back to Mo. The connection is told to be okay. And of course, if I wasn't running Envoy, then at that point it would say connections failed. It would then tell you that you need to go ahead and install Envoy or get Envoy running in order to do that. And then of course, you're also given an understanding of how many credits you have available. Since everything's set up and okay, I don't have to hit save, but I'll just go ahead and cancel. It's still now telling me that I have a next step on my status here. And the status for here is open or create a database or a Mo database. And to do that, I could either type one in, new.mdb, or I can just go ahead and hit one that I've already opened in the prior. And the nice thing about this is this now is saving any of my previous calculations. So let me go ahead and open that up. Here's a familiar MDB file that just has a bunch of settings to it. This happened to be one that was running some scoring, so it has some scoring information, and then it has some information associated with where this data had come from. You can also see this list here, and so this sidecar then becomes our browser for all the information in that MDB file. And you can jump back and forth between the various versions. You can see that in this case, that ligand, which of course is right here, is moving back and forth based upon, in this case, really the only setting or the only difference was it was set to optimize. Well, that's all fine and good, but maybe we want to go ahead and add now our new version or maybe a new ligand. And maybe a great example might be if I say, go ahead and remove this nitrogen. Once I've removed that, now this is a new version of that ligand. And so therefore I should hit optimize. And I could, of course, choose to optimize the whole pocket, or I could even choose to dock that ligand within the active site. And that is an option that's fully packaged within the interface as well. But just for the sake of speed, I'm going to go ahead and just optimize the ligand. And I hit the add button. Now you can see now that took just a few seconds to optimize. And now you can see that it's running the empty score in order to see it happen or to run the calculation. Now, because I have chosen to run this on GridMarkets, this is actually running remotely. So let's go ahead and go over to the Envoy interface. And to do that again, I can hit that and then just pop right over to it. And in just a second here, you can now see that we have a new job that's sitting up here. Now we know this is a new job because all the rest of them, of course, have been completed, so they're in blue. If you had any failures or errors or anything else, they'd be in red. And in this case, we see this is just in gray. And this means that it's effectively sitting and waiting to run the calculation. And this takes a certain amount of time for the upload to happen, certainly at a queue, those sorts of things. And then once it runs, then it will run to completion and then bring back all that information and download it back to your computer. While that's running, why don't we go ahead and go through another one, because maybe we've decided that we want to make an additional change to this structure. Who knows? Maybe we want to change that proton to a CO2. Now that, of course, then has added that on to the group, and that now becomes a new ligand and a new modified ligand. I could really go through and do anything that's acceptable from a Mo perspective. If I make that change there, and of course you can see that starts getting pretty large, starts to press into the active site. So we'll see what happens when we optimize it. Again, because I made some changes now, maybe I'll go ahead and have this pocket, the full pocket optimized instead of just the ligand. And I hit add. And you can see the whole thing moving around. And again, this probably wasn't a best fitting molecule for this, but again, it is something we can do. And again, we have this running. There's our first one and our second one. Now we know that because right now the end state scores are just set to be 0, 0, and 0 because it's waiting for the calculation to come back. Another thing that's happening is you can see back to our MDB file here. you can see that there are actually file names that are beginning to be populated here. And what these are the file names that will be populated or will be fully maintained once the data comes back from GridMarkets and downloads onto Envoy. And then at that time, of course, it fill in the end state, which it would have obtained through the JSON file that's here. And we go ahead and go back over here. And again, now we see both of these jobs now are starting. So they're syncing. And then again, in a few minutes, they'll begin. And we can just do this really as often as we wish. We could continue to make changes to this molecule. We could dock it. We could do whatever we wish, all in parallel to what's running remotely. And then this would just list down the line here all of the calculations. On top of that, once I'm done for the day, or maybe just done for lunch or whatever, I've run all my or I've begun all of my calculations. Maybe I'm still waiting for them to download. I can actually go ahead and I can quit out of Mo, and once I restart Mo and restart my interface here, it would actually populate at that time. So once we've submitted this job to run, we're going to go ahead and while we wait for that to download. Let's go ahead and run the same calculation, but now in this case on the command line or using our command line interface. And we can do that through the command line tool that's also available within the Mo DivCon GM package, and which is called QMechanic. So if I run this is just a shell script that has a wrapper to send all of these commands up to GridMarkets. And I can do that. If you recall a few minutes ago in Mo, we opened the PDB file and the mol2 file. Well, since they're here, we'll go ahead and use those straight out. And all of these command line options, by the way, they are available on our website as tutorials. In fact, every different setting or every different command line option that is available on our website, whether it has to do with MovableType or QMMM refinement, optimization, so on and so forth, anything that has QMechanic to it could actually be run on the GridMarkets platform. Once you have installed this script. So for here, I'll just go ahead and run and choose what ligand I want to run, which of course, if you recall, was this mol2. And I'll type, and I want to do an end state empty score, which of course is what I'm running over here on the Mo interface. And we'll just say, give it a little bit of verbosity. And then here is the key. This key addition then tells the script, don't run it locally, which of course, since I haven't installed the software locally, that would throw an error. Instead, what it does is it says, I want to run this now remotely on the cloud, specifically on GridMarkets. And I go and I press return. And once that comes back, then you can see right off the bat, the same information on both this side and that side. You can see there's some credits there. There's credits over here. This is telling you, of course, what machines it's running on, what DivCon version and what Envoy version. Both of those were all the same information on both sides. And in fact, it also gives you this nice URL, which is the same one that we looked at over here. And once I've loaded this into my browser, you can see the same activities are going on here. So now we have these two, which were the ones that we ran earlier from Mo. Those are now complete. So we'll take a look at the results here in a few minutes. Those are now complete. And then finally, this one here is now the one that's starting, and it's currently in the sync up phase. And interestingly enough, what happens here is all of these files, everything else that you've provided on the command line automatically are uploaded to the GridMarkets platform. In addition to running an end state calculation, we can go ahead and run an ensemble calculation as well. And you recall when we were talking about MovableType, it has both an end state regime and an ensemble regime. Ensemble computations are actually the same protein, the same ligand, but in several different conformations, but probably done through molecular dynamics, docking, so on and so forth. So we'll go ahead and do that. And I'll again run the same script. And we'll grab this. We'll just use the first one as our defining file. You'll notice in this case, though, there is no .mol2 version of this. So now I know there's no ligand in here necessarily. I instead know what the ligand's name is within that file. So let's go ahead and do that. If I look at what I know, it's called lig. So if I look at that PDB file, I grep for lig, and I can see there's my ligand. And this happens to be the same ligand that I was running earlier. Again. And we use some selection here that we're just going to say that we want to run the ligand as our ligand, or lig as our ligand. And instead of saying end state like I did a few minutes ago, I'm going to say ensemble. And of course, since I want to provide multiple poses, in this case, 5 poses that we have available, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, I'll go ahead and provide, I'll say empty doc, even though I'm not necessarily actually running empty doc. These are the nexus points that I was mentioning earlier during the talk. And I can just take them all in. This would be, as you'd expect, a wildcard that will just take all of those 1 through 5 and provide them all as docked poses. And then finally give us a little bit of verbosity. And then again, here's our key is cloud GridMarkets. Press return. And you can see that it's again giving this information and again telling you where to look at in terms of the Envoy environment. So let's go ahead and go back over there. And there we go. It updates, and there's our nice script, our complex that we just started just a few minutes ago. So now we have this one starting. These two are complete. So those 2 calculations are complete. And then finally, the one that I just submitted a minute ago is just waiting. And what that's waiting for is just simply the infrastructure, the upload, the process that's going on. So while we wait for that, let's go ahead and go back over to the Mo interface, where you'll now see these values now have been filled in. So these are associated with the ones that we just modified. That's the one that we made a little bigger. This is sorting, so that's why the order changed, just sorting by the end state score. This ended up being actually the better score, which is interesting. And this one ended up also being actually a pretty good score as well. And then finally, some of the other ones. Now this gives you the overall end state score. But if we go back over to the command line, we can look at those files that, if you recall, were in the MDB file. The MDB file lists a log file associated with each one, and then a JSON file associated with each one. The JSON file, of course, is more computer readable. The log file is the user readable one. And so let's just go and look at the one that's associated with our most recent addition. And that would be this one right here, the bottom one. And that was file name. And that's 1334. Let's look at 1334. And you'll see an MT log. This is the file that is the one that corresponds to the one that's in the NDB file. And you can see there's the human readable version. And if you had run QMechanic locally on your own machine, for example, if you had your own old installer or whatever, you of course would see the same information. And so this way, whether you run it remotely on GridMarkets or locally on your own computer, you still are able to obtain the information. And so you're not limited to just what is allowed to be downloaded. Everything will get downloaded to your computer from GridMarkets. And that way then too, if you had any scripts or anything else, you could look at those as well. But you can see here that here's your end state score, -9.73. And within round off, you have 9.73 here as well. Now let's go ahead and take a look and see how our other jobs are faring. These of course are running. or starting, and then we should have, oh, there's another one that's been completed. And that one is available too. And once that one then is completed and downloaded, then it would be available for your local visuals as well. Now, because you didn't run that from within Mo, it's not going to update on the Mo interface, but it is something that would be allowed to, that you would be able to script or process through your log file. I hope that gives you a better understanding of how to run MovableType through the Mo interface and through the command line. If you have any questions, certainly reach out. And as I said, all of the tutorials are available on our website as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lance. Great job as usual. And I'm Doyle Oakey, Vice President of Global Sales for GridMarkets. Lance was spot on when he mentioned the free trial that we're offering to all of you, where we'll provide you with 50 free ligands to trial the QuantumBio functionality. You can find that at pharma.gridmarkets.com/QuantumBio. If you have any questions or issues you'd like to take up with us, please don't hesitate to send an email to quantumbio@gridmarkets.com. Thanks. Over to Wendy.
Thank you, Doyle, and thank you, Lance, for that incredible presentation. We now have time to take a few questions from the audience. First question is for you, Lance. Can you use an ANI1, an extensible neural network potential, with DFT accuracy at force field computational cost?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for a really good question. Yeah. So in principle, the short answer is yes. In principle, any pair potential, regardless of where it came from, would work with MovableType. Where I guess you could say in this case, the issue would be we don't have necessarily an input to provide that in a specialized potential that wouldn't fall into an Amber-like potential. But in principle, yes, that could actually be done. That would just be some additional work to allow that. It's a good question, though. That is an area of certainly of a lot of interest, whether it's a neural network or any number of potentials that are now being trained with DFT.
Awesome, thank you. Next question, another question here from the audience as well. Should the strain energy of the ligand, i.e. potential energy as bound minus potential energy of local minimum, be considered with respect to the set of docked poses submitted to MovableType? That's the first part of the question. And then the second part is, if so, in parentheses, seems obvious, what is a reasonable range of strain energies?
Yeah, so yeah, that certainly you'd want to do a certain amount of filtering. A great example of that is we've run into cases where maybe somebody didn't optimize their ligand to begin with, and so maybe you just ended up with docked poses that were fairly strained and everything else. And so part of it certainly is you do want to filter your poses in some way. Strain energy is certainly a good one. I mean, you always say, well, the lower the better, obviously, but yeah, I mean, in our experience, 3K cal, 5K cal, they're probably in that realm of acceptability, in part because it depends on how you are calculating strain. There's actually several different ways of calculating it, but that would be either one of those would probably be acceptable. 10K cal, you're starting to get a little high. I will tell you that our internal cutoff, and it doesn't go directly to what you're likely conceptualizing as kcal. It actually does do a 15K cal cutoff. But again, that's only because we're trying to get rid of just a ton of crazy conformations that could be potentially generated.
Awesome, thank you. And next question is also for you, Lance. When you construct your vector of potential energies for your partition function, what is the composition of the potential energies? The ligand self energy, the energy of the entire system, energy of the ligand interacting with the protein? Is any type implicit solvation included?
Yes, yes. The answer to all those questions is yes. It is a statistical mechanics potential or a statistical mechanics approach, and so therefore you do have the unbound ligand, unbound protein, and bound protein ligand complex. So those partition functions are all generated. And then in terms of implicit salvation, yes, there's actually a paper that came out a number of years ago. I can if I can share in a chat, I can actually send you everyone the DOI. But it came out a few years ago in JCTC. John Zhang was the primary author under it, and we used a very similar implicit salvation model. I didn't really go into it just for time, but basically you can think of it as another bound and unbound relationship. So we get the unbound, the bound protein, and the ligand and the target, and then take that delta. And then we have a delta G solved correction.
Thank you again, Lance. Another question for you. Is it possible to perform some type of decomposition analysis of the free energy changes? For example, can I determine the contribution of a portion of the ligand with respect to the computed free energy? First part of the question. Second part of the question is, conversely, can I estimate the contribution of one or more binding site amino acids with respect to the free energy of binding? Question mark. Chemists are often asked, what is the interaction worth?
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that's always a critical question too, in part because you want to understand what fragments, for example, swap out. Again, you that would be something that, yes, you can in principle. We haven't added that as a piece of output, but it is certainly something I can take back to the group and pull that out. Because obviously we do have all of the pairs for all of the different atom pairs. And so in principle, yes, we could certainly do that. We just didn't decompose it. But that's a good question and something we can certainly take back to the group to add in fairly easily.
Thank you, Lance. Next question as well for you, and maybe the GridMarkets team as well. The question is, what does the service cost?
So it would be, so we ended up actually kind of, I think, coming up with a pretty creative way of pricing or costing this approach. In part because in my opinion anyway, when a computational chemist or as someone that works in the field wants to do a calculation, what they're really buying is value. And so they're not buying CPU time in their minds, they're buying value. They're buying what the CPU time gives them. And so for both MovableType, the end state and the ensemble scoring, we created a pricing model which would be on a per ligand basis. And so we've completely taken out the risk that's associated with how long a MovableType calculation runs, in part because MovableType is so fast, truth be told, but it is something that this way you don't end up with a $30,000 bill or whatever horror story folks have heard in the past of running from some other types of cloud computing environments. So in this case, it is, no matter what the cost of the MovableType part of the calculation is, for the end state, it's $10 and per ligand, and for the ensemble, it's $75 for the ligand as our introductory piece. It's a good question though. It's, like I said, I'm very excited about this approach to doing it on a per ligand basis instead of per CPU time basis.
Awesome, thank you. Next question looks like it is for Mark with QuantumBio, or excuse me, with GridMarkets. What machines do the QuantumBio submissions run on?
Thanks, Wendy. They run on AWS, Oracle, and Google. So GridMarkets automatically routes your request to the machines of our cloud providers, which are obviously very, very secure cloud providers, and that's where they run. We also have the ability, if you are interested in creating a private cluster, so I'd encourage you to contact us if that's something of interest, but basically they can either run on our cloud provider machines or on a private cluster that we would grade for you. Thanks, Wendy. Thank you.
Next question is also for Lance. Lance, you mentioned MovableType is faster. Why is it faster?
So a lot of it is because the way that its approach to sampling is significantly different than other orthogonal approaches to free energy prediction. So a lot of approaches will do a lot of dynamics and dynamic sampling, and that all creates a lot of cost, CPU cost. And of course, as I said, you can do that if you run into a case where the target is doesn't work very well with just simply a docked set of poses or whatnot. You can certainly use dynamics if you need to. The difference is you don't have to. And so the big saver then is that most of these calculations, the MovableType will run that quickly. And actually, MovableType itself, and goes back to that point with the pricing, is MovableType itself that part of the calculation doesn't take any more or less time, whether they're dynamic snapshots or docked poses. It's just in what the time it takes to generate the conformers can be different.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Lance. Again, we're lots of questions for you today, Lance. The next question is, can the Mo job and DivCon job be serially? I think what they're asking is, can the job be run one after another on the cloud without waiting for the intermittent results to be downloaded?
Yes, so it can be done that way through the Mo interface and the Mo plugin. There's a tasking environment that will go and send both jobs up. Basically, it sends up the Mo task. That's all run with Mo and Mo's approach, and so that's all falls under the Mo calculation part of the simulation. And then what happens is then the next task is queued up, and that just simply copies the data from one task to the other. The nice thing is for us is then that's that it completely separates those two job approaches or calculations. What we have not yet put in is the ability to do the same thing on GridMarkets with Amber, GROMACS, and NAMD, which are also available on there. Conceptually, we can do it. We just have not added that yet.
Thank you. Let's see. Next question looks like it might be for Mark. The question is, I'm interested in your free trial that was mentioned during the demo in the presentation. How do I get started?
It's pretty easy. Go to this page, which is the pharma.gridmarkets.com QuantumBio page, which I got from clicking on the services option here and hitting that option there. Once you do that, then there will be a Start QuantumBio free trial, which I'm hovering over right now. If I click on that, it will take me to this page. This is the getting started page. So everything you need is on this page. First step, excuse me. First step is to create an account. And if you click on this button, a little form will pop up and ask you a few basic questions like, what is your first name, last name, email address, that sort of stuff. And then the second step is to download and install Envoy. Envoy, you'll recall from Lance's demo, is the solution that allows your files to be transferred and to be submitted, basically. And we have 3 different flavors of Envoy, one for Windows, one for Linux, and one for Mac. So depending on what you're using, you download the appropriate version. And that's it. If you want to use the command line submission option, you can also download this. And if you continue scrolling down, there's a little video here which describes how to get up and running and how to get your first submission underway. It's easy as that.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mark. And it looks like we have time for just one more question. Rather important question. We'll pop back up our screen that has some contact information on it, which might be helpful. But the question is for you, Lance, and it asks, how can they contact you to learn more?
Yeah, no, yeah, and that's a critical one. Yeah, so the email addresses, of course, mine is up on the screen, and also the one, of course, with the folks at GridMarkets. And then if you are at the ACS conference this week, I'm actually here, so I'm sitting in the conference center as we speak. So certainly, you can find me at the conference as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to thank you, Lance, for the incredible presentation. Thank our audience for their attendance today. As Lance mentioned, if you're on the ground at ACS, do look him up if you'd like to continue the conversation or have any questions, or reach out to Lance and Doyle or Mark at the email addresses on your screen. If you're at ACS, have an amazing conference, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot, everyone.